in its settings tells you how far it has to be off of your body to prevent cancer. It tells you. If you go to your settings, to general, you scroll all the way down to legal and regulatory. Who knew this was in the BALs? Do you see it?
I'm in it.
Legal and regulatory, click it. The very bottom one says RF exposure. That stands for radio frequency exposure. And then it tells you, mine is on the second paragraph, this must be 5 millimeter separation off of your body. It's about a pencil eraser. So they're covered when you get brain cancer because you put your phone to your head.
I always speak on speakerphone.
You bet you do. Distance is your friend with radio frequency, with electromagnetic fields.
So does cell phone use cause brain cancer? I'll cut right to the chase and say, no, it doesn't. There is no evidence that it does, but let me review the evidence to reassure you why this is not something you have to worry about. There's enough things to worry about in this world. This is not one of them. This concern, the notion that electromagnetic radiation, electromagnetic waves somehow causes diseases, goes back decades and decades. And it has been raised as a concern ever since cell phone use has become commonplace. Cell phone use obviously skyrocketed in the 1990s. So over a very short period of time, we went from almost nobody using cell phones to almost everybody using cell phones. And it has, the question of whether or not exposure to RF, radio frequency radiation from cell phones, because you hold it close to your head, does it increase the risk of anything? Does it increase the risk of brain cancer specifically? And so the studies now, we have decades of research looking at this question. The World Health Organization just recently published a systematic review of all of this research. And it quite clearly shows that there is no correlation between cell phone use and the risk of brain cancer. That is true whether you're a child, an adult, or if you work in the industry, or there's no correlation depending on how many hours per day you use your cell phone. There was no dose response curve. There basically was just no signal there. There was no increased correlation between brain cancer and cell phone use. It's always hard to, just logistically to prove a negative, to prove that something is of zero risk. But what we can say is after 20 plus years of studying this and of many, many studies that were covered in that review, the fact that there is no signal in the data, that there is no evidence of any increased risk of cancer is pretty reassuring. It means that if there is any increased risk there, it's so tiny, it's not worth worrying about. This also makes sense based on just scientific principles, on basic science, because the frequency of electromagnetic radiation used in cell phones is non-ionizing. Now, what that means is it's too low energy to break chemical bonds. We know that ionizing radiation is a cancer risk because it can break chemical bonds. It can cause mutations in the DNA, and those mutations can cause, and they can also mutate proteins. It could change break the chemical bonds in proteins. That can cause cell damage. It can mutate DNA. It can cause cells to become cancerous. Radio frequency waves are non-ionizing. They can't break chemical bonds, so there's no real mechanism for there to cause cancer. The question has always been, well, do they do anything? Even if they're non-ionizing, can that energy do anything? And what it does do is it heats the tissue slightly. There's a little bit of tissue heating from the energy from the radio frequency waves. Does that tiny amount of tissue heating cause cancer or increase your risk for cellular disease of any type? And the answer appears to be no. That, again, there's no evidence that that is the case. But there is this kind of semi-plausible, at least something's happening. You can say, well, we have to study this to make sure that there's no risk here. It's been studied. There's no risk here. So the other sort of wrinkle to this whole question is we studied 3G, but have we done enough research into 5G? And there's always a new standard coming along. You say, well, it's higher energy or higher frequency, and just because it doesn't cause any cancer at the lower frequencies doesn't mean that the same is true of the higher frequencies. So so you could resurrect this question every time there's a change in the standard. And certainly, we need to study them just to continue to reassure that there is no risk here. But at this point, it's very unlikely that even 6G or whatever the next thing is going to be fundamentally different in terms of its effects on biology than 3G, 4G, or 5G was. So this has been researched extensively. The research has been reviewed. There just isn't any correlation with increased risk of brain cancer and use of cell phones. So don't let the fear mongering get to you.